we're kicking off a new series. We've got a 3-week series here called Do-Over, how to have a fresh start with God. And so I want to start with this question, have you ever wanted a do-over? Have you ever wanted a chance to start fresh? Have you ever had that feeling of wanting to put kind of your failure behind you and start a new route? You know what that feels like? Because I certainly do. I'm guessing all of us in here have had a do-over moment. Some of you might be in the middle of a do-over moment. I'm kind of in the middle of a do-over moment right now in my life. You see, over the past 3 years, I lost about 30 pounds, and I gained about 30 pounds. And it's pretty depressing. It's pretty depressing for clothes to be tight again when clothes were loose before. It's really discouraging to have all that hard work that I did for like a year and a half kind of disappear through a year and a half of some really bad health decisions. And some of my numbers, like my blood sugar and all of that, are getting out of whack again. And it's really discouraging because I kind of feel like a failure. And I wonder what people think when they see me, when they saw me then and they see me now. And I don't care about the ones who knew me when I was even heavier. That's fine. But it's really hard to sit there and know that I kind of squandered some really good stuff I had in my life. And I think that's fundamentally what this do-over moment is about. When we can look back at our life and see a time when it was better, when we were making better decisions, when we weren't involved in some of the things we're involved in, and then we look at life now and go, man, I've just driven my life into a ditch. What do I do now? And the answer is I want a do-over. I want another chance. I want another chance to lose another 30 pounds and hopefully not gain it back 3 years later. But I want a chance to put my failure behind me. And I think there are a lot of us who want that. I don't know what failure you're living with right now. I don't know what failure you're carrying. But chances are there's a part of your life where you kind of like a do-over. So I don't know what it is. I don't know whether it's a habit that started out small and has now gotten out of control. Whether it's porn or drinking or drugs or gaming or gambling or shopping or whatever. But you might have a habit that is now out of control and it's consuming you and it's controlling you. And you kind of I wish I could have a do-over with this. Or maybe it's anger. Maybe it was a single event, a single fight you had with your spouse, with your parents, and you said things, or did things, or threw things that you wish you hadn't, and you don't know what to do now. You never had something like that prior, and you hope you never will, but you had one of those explosions of anger. And you kind of sit and say, I want to do over. Or maybe you're just racking up credit card debt. You're just shopping like nobody's business. You know you shouldn't. And maybe you need to listen to the money series this summer, but you're still spending, and it's on clothes and going out to eat, and you're just racking up the credit card. And you just don't know what to do, and you're sitting there going, this is out of control. I want to do over. Or maybe it's like me. Maybe it's your health, where your health has gone south, and you're kind of ignoring good eating and ignoring exercise, and whether it's your gout, your blood pressure, your weight, your cholesterol, diabetes, whatever it is that's starting to go wrong in your body, maybe that's your do-over. And you want a chance to put your failure behind you. To not be defined. Like, I want to be defined by who I was 2 years ago, not who I am now. But that's a whole lot of years to put behind me. And so I don't know what it is for you, but I bet you have a do-over moment. Some of you might even be living in your do-over moment. Well, if that's you, then this is a good series for you. Because we're going to talk about how to get a fresh start with God. We're going to talk about how do you put failure behind you. And we're going to do that by looking at the greatest do-over in Bible history. Now, when you talk about the Bible and do-overs, you might think of like Peter. He was Jesus' right-hand guy, and he denied Jesus. The whole rooster crowing, all of that. And so you might think Peter. No, that's not the biggest do-over. Okay? Or you might think King David. He slept with a married woman. She got pregnant. He basically had her husband killed in battle and took her for his wife. God restored him. That's still not the biggest do-over in the Bible. This is a do-over in the Bible that lasted hundreds of years. And the sin that was involved here makes anything any of us have done look like tiny compared to what happened here. And the punishment was huge. The sin was huge. The punishment was huge. But the restoration was huge. So we're going to look at that gigantic do-over. We're going to spend 3 weeks looking at 3 of the big people involved in that do-over. Because I think we can learn some lessons from them. That God gave them a do-over. And they did some things really well. And I think we can learn from that. So what is this do-over? Who are these people? It was the Israelites. And it was the Israelites, so in the Old Testament, the Israelites had the single biggest do-over in Bible history. Because what was their screw-up? What was so bad? That they fundamentally turned their back on God. And I'm not just talking like a day, or maybe you've had a week where you've kind of just forgotten God, or maybe it's been a few months. No. For the Israelites, this was hundreds of years of turning away from God. So, let me back up a sec, because I need to give a little bit of context on this. Okay? So, I'm going to give you the Old Testament, a good portion of Old Testament history in about 3 minutes. Okay, so ready for this? I'm going to talk really fast. Okay. But here we go. So, God chose the Israelites to be His chosen people. He pulled them out of nowhere. Why Israelites? We don't know. He chose some of the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Moses comes later. And God gave this group of people that they were sort of small and nomads, and then they were slaves, and God freed them from that slavery, and He gave them the law. You might have heard of it as the Mosaic law or the Levitical law. It's a big part of it is out of the book of Leviticus. Which is in the Old Testament. I kind of joke Leviticus is where read the Bible and a year goes to die. It's a tough book to read if you've ever tried to read the book of Leviticus. But that was the law. God gave the law to the Israelites to transform them. To transform them from nomads and slaves to God's chosen people and a kingdom of world changers. That was God's desire for the Israelites. So He gave them this law. And then God gave them some leaders because they kept turning away from God. But it was only a little. They would turn a little bit, and then a leader would come and help them get back. They would turn a little bit, they'd get beaten by one of the enemies, God would help them turn back. And they did that cycle for a while. And then they called out for a king. God gave them a king. And it started out okay. Saul was a king. David was a king. Solomon was a king. Maybe some of those names you've heard around churches before. But the problem is, it did not take long in the kingly reigns for things to go really bad. And I'm not talking like Game of Thrones bad. I'm talking horrible. There were a few good kings, but the majority of them, the majority of the 30 or so kings that they had, were terrible. In fact, the Bible describes many of these kings with the same phrase. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so they had centuries, decades and centuries of turning away from God. They started worshiping other gods. There was violence. There was civil war. The nation actually split into two. There was so much civil war. So there was infighting. There's even support, when we read the Bible, there was even support of child sacrifices to foreign gods. That's how bad this had gotten. And this lasted hundreds of years. So God punished them. God had chosen them and made a promise, a covenant with them that said, if you follow me, I will protect you, I will provide you land, I will lift you up. And they turned their back on God. And God said, okay, I will withdraw my protection from you. And he withdrew his presence from them. And he allowed the neighboring, their enemies, the bigwigs, the big powerful nations in the area to take them over. And so these nations came in, they enslaved the Israelites. They took them out of the land that God promised them. They took them into captivity. And it wasn't bad enough that they just took them from their land, which was Jerusalem, was their home. That wasn't just bad enough. They went and leveled the place. They destroyed Jerusalem. And they destroyed the temple, which was in Jerusalem, which was the most holy place in all Israelite world. God let the enemies destroy it. And so for 70 years it stayed that way. For 70 years, the Israelites, everything that God had promised to them, God allowed to be taken away from them. And they lived like that for 70 years. Think they wanted a do-over? I want a do-over just after a year or two of bad decision-making. They had 70 years being away from their home, their land, everything that was meaningful to them, and living as captives in a foreign land. They wanted a do-over. And we don't have a whole lot in some of the Old Testament books about what the people in captivity, kind of the everyday person was thinking. But I'm willing to bet they were asking some questions. I'm willing to bet they had some questions. It's questions like, does God still love us? Are we still his people? How can I go back to him after what we've done? And once I go back, where do I start? And I imagine these Israelites, some of whom, if you think 70 years, that means an old men and women had spent their entire lives, they had never known Jerusalem. Spent their entire lives in captivity. Kind of wondering, has God forgotten about us? Could God even take us back? Or has God left us completely? And I think those questions are important because I think those are the questions that we often ask. When we've kind of driven our life into a ditch, where things have gotten so bad, the stuff we've gotten involved in, we've gotten so deep that we can't get out, and we start asking the questions. Does God still love me? Would he even want me back? How could God love me after what I've done? Because I think we ask those same questions. But I think what this story tells us is that we have a God of second chances. We have a God of the great do-over. So that when we ask those questions, there are answers. We are not left to ourselves, left in sorrow and despair, because the answer we think is, no, he could never love me again. I don't think I could even call myself a Christian after what I've done. I've blown it so badly, I can't even go back to church. But what this story tells us is God does do-overs. So this particular do-over is found in two books. In the Old Testament, two books called Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, these are historical books, which are different than, I talk about the prophet books sometimes. That's Isaiah and Jeremiah. I know they kind of sound the same, but so the Isaiah, Jeremiah, Spicy Papaya, those are all the prophet books. Okay? Wait, you don't have that in your Bible? That's I know. So those are some of the prophet books. But these two, Ezra and Nehemiah, these are historical books. So they're much more factual, not as much of kind of the big metaphors and glowing visions. These are very historical books. And in our Bibles, if you look into your little table of contents or your tabs or flip around to the screen and you look, you might see Ezra and Nehemiah as two separate books. But to the Israelites, and even to the early Christians, they actually combined them into one book. You can sort of call it Ezra-miah. How's that? So they were actually one book. They're believed to be written by the same author. And while they have a little bit of overlap, they actually tell one good story. So we're going to look at three selections over the course of the next 3 weeks in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we're going to look at some of the people who played a significant role in this. Because I think what we can learn from them can help us with our own do-overs. Okay? So we're going to start with in the book of Ezra, but not with the guy named Ezra. The guy is actually next week. Okay? But we're going to talk about another guy. And here, there are two people who kind of start this off. Because I think with every do-over, we have one question. The very first question that I think we have is, where do I start? I've kind of blown it with my health the last year and a half. Where do I start? Should I go out and start running? Should I start eating better? Should I start logging my food? What should I do? Should I go to a doctor? What should I do? And I think we all ask that when we want a do-over. When the car's in the ditch, you ask, what do I do? And I think that's what these guys were asking. What do we do? And there were two people who had an answer to that question. There are two people who kind of kicked this off. Because you see, remember where we left off? They were enslaved by the foreign enemies for 70 years. And God chose after those 70 years to release them. So God moved in the hearts of the enemies and allowed, actually the kings of the earth, allowed them to leave and go back to their hometown, Jerusalem. Okay? But you need to remember what I talked about Jerusalem? Remember, this is what they came back to. Here's a picture of what Jerusalem probably kind of looked like a little bit. It was destroyed. And now, that's not actually Jerusalem, that's just a big pile of rubble. But that's what was left, man. Because they laid waste to Jerusalem. So imagine this group of Israelites, some of whom had spent their entire life in captivity. They go back to the great home of Jerusalem and they walk up, and that's what they see. Have you ever kind of looked at your life and thought it kind of looked like that? Things have gotten so bad you feel like your life is sort of in rubbles. So there were two guys in particular who kind of led the group there. One was a priest named Joshua. Okay, now this isn't, if you know some Old Testament, this isn't Joshua who was Moses' protege, different Joshua. In fact, many, many years apart. So this is a priest named Joshua. And then another guy who was kind of like a governor. His name was Zerubbabel. And that's just fun to say. Any word with that many B's, Zerubbabel, is fun to say. Okay? So we got two guys here. We got Joshua and Zerubbabel. And they kind of led, I know, see, it's just funny to listen to. Okay? And so they kind of led the way. And they arrived there and surveyed over their great city that was in shambles. And they said, where do we start? Where do we start with a city that is now a wreck? Where do we start with a life that is now a wreck? Or health that is a wreck? Or a habit that has created a wreck? Where do we start? Well, Joshua and Zerubbabel knew where to start. So we're going to actually pick up that story. So this is in the book of Ezra, chapter 3. The book of Ezra, chapter 3. And we're going to read just the first 6 verses. We're just doing a little snippet, a couple out of Ezra and one out of Nehemiah to get you a bit, and I'll kind of fill in the pieces. Okay? So up to now, the king, the foreign king, the bad guys, they released the Israelites, and gave them all kinds of food and materials, and then they had a whole list of everyone who came, and then they came. So this is where Ezra 3 picks up. Here it is. Verses 1 through 6. When the 7th month came, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Jehozadak, and his fellow priests, so there's Joshua the priest, and he had his crew, okay? And then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, so Zerubbabel had his crew, so we had kind of a West Coast, East Coast thing going here. They fought, it was horrible. No, they didn't do that. Okay? So we had Joshua and his crew, and Zerubbabel and his crew. They began to build an altar of God, an altar of the God of Israel, to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what was written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Remember I talked about the law? The law was something that God gave them to transform them from nomads and slaves into a people of God. The law was given to transform them into kind of a wreck, into world changers and God worshipers. So once again, the first thing they did, they built an altar. Okay? Now here's a picture of what the altar might have looked like. Right? That it was maybe it was a little bigger, maybe a little smaller. We don't really know, but we do know it was flat, kind of high, and then they had these little things on the corners. Okay, but realistically, remember the picture of what Jerusalem probably looked like. So this is probably a little closer to what their altar really looked like. Just a pile of rocks, because they didn't have clean-cut stones at that point. So they probably piled up some rocks, tried to make it as flat as they could. Because again, remember, this is what Jerusalem looked like, was just a mess. So they probably piled the rocks the best they could, and they made an altar. Now, why on earth make an altar? Like, shouldn't you maybe clean up a little bit, or get some food, find a well for some water? That's what Bear Grylls would do. They would find some food and water and shelter. But I don't think Bear Grylls would have built an altar. But that's what they did. And the key is there was that phrase that in accordance with the law. Because remember, for them, the law was the instructions of how to be in relationship with God. And so the first thing they did was they built an altar. Okay? Let's continue. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, because they had enemies and stuff around them who might attack them, they didn't know. Despite the fear of the peoples around them, they built an altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord. Both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what was written in the law, that's what was written, they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, which are more offerings, okay, and the sacrifices for all the anointed sacred festivals of the Lord, and as well as those brought free will offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. So before they even built the foundation of the temple, they were sacrificing. Okay? Now, you don't need a seminary degree to figure out what was pretty important to them. Burnt offerings. Sacrifices. Okay? Now, we have to kind of understand a little bit about what these burnt offerings were. So here's a little bit about what burnt offerings. So first, here's a picture of what it might have looked like on one of those altars. So we have a priest over there, and it's basically a gigantic barbecue. Okay? So here's a little bit now. There's a big altar with, there's some meat depending on what people brought for the sacrifice, but that's a little bit of what a sacrifice might have looked like. But why did they do this? Particularly, did you notice the repetition of burnt offerings? They did a lot of burnt offerings. Now, there's something special about burnt offerings. You see, there are actually 5 different types of offerings that the law in Leviticus talks about. Burnt offerings is just one of them. And yeah, they mention free will offerings, but really, burnt offerings kind of play the major role there. So why? What's the big deal about burnt offerings? Why was it repeated so many times there? Well, you have to understand a little bit about the burnt offerings. So for instance, burnt offerings is the very first sacrifice ever mentioned in the Bible. It was Noah. Okay? Noah offered a burnt offering sacrifice. Okay? It's also the very first offering listed in the book of Leviticus. Literally, Leviticus 1:1 is burnt offerings. Out of an entire book of guidelines of how to be in relationship with God. You know what chapter 1, verse 1 is? Here's how to do a burnt offering. And it's the first one that Joshua and Zerubbabel did when they came back to Jerusalem. The burnt offering is an offering of firstness. All throughout the Bible, that's what you see. It's one of the most common offerings. They did it morning and evenings. And fundamentally, and here's the thing, why this burnt offering played such a big role in the do-over. Because we could pause here and be like, okay, you want a do-over in your life? Go torch a small animal. That's horrible. Okay, don't do that. God has not called us to be in a relationship with Him like that, thankfully. Because I love animals too much. That would be really hard. I especially love some of them barbecue. So we don't go out. That's not the first step to a do-over. Okay, don't go do that. But if we understand why a burnt offering was so important, if we understand what a burnt offering meant to the Israelites, then we can see very clearly the first step to a do-over. So the burnt offering is very interesting. So what this was a symbolic forgiveness of sins. This burnt offering was the most basic forgiveness of sins type offering. Here's a good Bible word for you: atonement. This was an offering for atonement, which means to make right the sins that you've been doing and making wrong. And for the Israelites, this is how God instructed them to make right their wrongs. To atone for their sins was this burnt offering. This offering would gain acceptance by God when you do one of these offerings. Because what happened is the person who brought, let's say the dove, the Levitical law allowed for the very poor people to bring just a little bird, because they couldn't afford something big. They couldn't afford a whole cow, just a little bird. So let's say you bring a little bird. And what happened here is that you would bring it, the priest would be there, but you as the one offering would actually have to lay your hand on the animal being sacrificed. And that was a symbolic transmission of your sin onto the animal being sacrificed. It was symbolic. They knew that, we know that, okay? It's not like sin actually traveled into the cow, but no, it was a symbolic gesture. But it was very clear that the person had to be there and actually touch the sacrifice and then kill it. And that animal lost its life for the person who sinned. And that was the significance. That's why it's the beginning of a do-over. Because fundamentally what the burnt offering did, better than any other of the offerings, it put someone's sin front and center to their life. And it offered them forgiveness for their sin. That's why they did it first. Because they knew for hundreds of years, we as a people have failed. I can just imagine, we as a people have failed you, God. And later on in the books, we're actually going to see some of that. But they knew they had a lot of sin and rebellion to ask God's forgiveness for, to atone for. And so they started with the way God, the method, the means by which God gave forgiveness to the Israelites, which was a burnt offering. So they did a lot of it. That was their first step. But what's ours? Because God does not call us to sacrifice animals. That when Jesus Christ came, he changed the way. The way we are in relationship with God changed forever. And that law, that instruction that God gave to the Israelites said, I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to keep sacrificing animals. Because I'm going to make one sacrifice for all people, for all time. I'm going to give one final sacrifice for atonement. One burnt offering. One sacrifice to atone for sins. And in this one sacrifice, every hand that was ever laid, and every hand that will ever be laid, was laid. And that was the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So when Jesus died on the cross, he was like the bull. He was like the sheep. He was like the dove. He was like the burnt offering. And in fact, all 5 of the types of offerings were all wrapped in together in the sacrifice of Jesus. So when Jesus came, God gave a new way for us to ask forgiveness for our sins. And that's by calling on the name of Jesus. And say, God, forgive me. Because Jesus died the death I deserved, or the death symbolically that these animals received, which was really mine. God, forgive me. And because Jesus gave that burnt offering, atonement, sacrifice, we don't have to. And that's the first step. That's the first step to a do-over. For the Israelites, it was a burnt offering. For us, it was coming face to face with Jesus Christ on the cross. His death and resurrection. And saying, forgive me, God. I have sinned against you, and I have sinned against others. I have sinned against myself, but fundamentally I have sinned against you. I would love to say that the first step to a do-over is for me to start eating healthier, or to start walking 30 minutes a day, 6 days a week. But that's not the first step. That will come, and that's important, but that's not the first step. The first step is to walk up to the altar that's built before Jesus Christ and say, God, I accept Jesus' sacrifice. Just like that Israelite who brought a goat or a sheep said, Yahweh God, I accept your sacrifice on this sheep for my sins. That's what we do. We walk up and say, God, in Jesus Christ, I accept the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for my sins. And that's the first step to a do-over. So there's a great way that the church has of walking up to the sacrifice, walking up to the altar, and accepting the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for our sins. There's a great way we have of remembering that. That's called communion. And so we're actually going to finish up the service with some communion and some worship. So what communion is a way for us to remember what Jesus Christ did. And we don't have altars like there were in the Old Testament, but I kind of like the fact that we have a little block here in front of us that we can approach. I'm not at all saying that we approach altars like the Israelites do, But we can approach this collection of little wafers and a little bit of juice as a remembrance of what Jesus did for us. The burnt offering sacrifice, the perfect lamb, the spotless male, the best of the best that got sacrificed for us. That's the beginning of a do-over. And I understand that in this room, what is represented are people that are on a long spectrum, a long journey of faith. We're not all in the same spot, and that's okay. For some of you've been following Jesus, and you've been doing your best. And some of you are doing well, and you're staying focused, and you're giving your life kind of each day to Jesus. For some of you, maybe that describes a time in your life, but that doesn't quite describe your life now. Maybe Jesus is a little further away now. He's a little bit more distant than he was in years past. And now's a time that you could come a little closer to Jesus. To come a little closer to that sacrifice that he made for you. For some of you, maybe you've always stayed a little far away. You've been around the Jesus stuff, but you've wanted to keep some distance. For those of you, it's time. If you want a do-over, it's time to walk up to Jesus. It's time to go from far away and distant to up close and personal. Now is a time where you say yes to Jesus. Yes to his sacrifice. Yes to his forgiveness for your sins. Okay? And that's all you have to say yes to. You don't have to say yes to conservative Christianity. You don't have to say yes to Republicans or pro-lifers or pro-choicers or whatever you kind of see Christianity being. You don't have to say yes to all of that. But you want to say yes to Jesus. And then there's some of you for whom this is kind of a new thing. This idea of coming up to Jesus. I always thought we were supposed to stay away from Jesus. He's too good, he's too holy, he's too perfect, and I am too opposite of all of that. I gotta stay back. That's the amazing thing about Jesus up on the cross. That he's up there because we are so messed up. That's why he's there. If we could approach him perfectly, he wouldn't need to be up on the cross. But he's there for us when we're far away. So, and then some of you are all sorts in between. So wherever you are in that journey, I want to invite you to remember what Jesus did